All right, family, episode number 89, Babylon. When we look at the New Testament, the really harsh and strong sayings of the New Testament most of the time are directed at self-righteousness and false teaching. When we see the movement of Jesus Christ, he's constantly going at it with the Pharisees, calling them things like, you have your father, the devil. And this is all because of their pride and their self-righteousness. When we look at the writings and the teachings of Paul, sometimes we do see Paul giving strong warnings against sexual immorality. But the real harsh and strong sayings of Paul, even I would go so far as to say threats from the Apostle Paul, are directed at false teaching. And something else that I see for me personally, when I make these videos and I do these teachings, sometimes people reach out to me and I get these like dramatic and emotional reactions to some of these teachings. It's because when you hear this revelation of law and grace, it starts putting things together. It starts making sense out of things that didn't make sense. And you feel like the Bible is coming together, like a puzzle. And what's happening is when somebody starts tearing down these walls of religion, it's like being set free from a prison. But I want to emphasize it's not about me. There's nothing special about me. It's just this understanding and this clarity of the scriptures when you apply this revelation of law and grace. Now, they say that Martin Luther, there's a quote that says Martin Luther liked to say many things over and over. He used to repeat the same things over and over because his revelation was the just shall live by faith. And me personally, I'm a Romans guy, and that's something that I like to repeat over and over and over. If there's anything you want to say about me, just say he's always talking about Romans. And today we're going to be coming out of Galatians, but I like to always set up context before we get into things. Romans is a book of doctrine, the book of doctrine. Everything that Christianity stands on starts with Romans. You got to have these chapters down. Those chapters 1 through 8, you got to have that down in order to have a clear understanding of what the gospel is, to have a clear understanding of what the cross means. You have to understand Romans before you get to that. But the supernatural design of the scriptures, because as soon as Paul lays down the doctrine and the foundation of Christianity, he immediately follows up with Corinthians, and Corinthians is a correction of bad behavior. So what he is saying is, now that you have this gift of righteousness, now that you have this forgiveness of sins, past, present, and future, this is not a license to act like a fool. It is not. It's specifically sexual immorality. So once he gets done that, then he comes over to Galatians, which is where we're going to be going today. He's talking about correction of bad doctrine. And when you start talking about bad doctrine, it's like the church takes that and applies all these different things to it, all these different definitions to it, when Paul is being very specific about what bad doctrine is. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but you got to have this set up before before you start reading these things. It's like reading a synopsis to a movie before you watch. So you got to have this macro level, this overview of what's being talked about. So I'm going to read from Galatians chapter 1, 6 through 10. This is the Passion Translation. I am shocked over how quickly you have strayed away from the one who called you in the grace of Christ. I'm astounded that you now embrace a distorted gospel, that is a fake gospel, that is simply not true. There is only one gospel, the good news of Christ. Yet you have allowed those who mingle law with grace to confuse you. I'm repeating that because this is the foundation of everything that we're talking about today. Yet you have allowed those who mingle law with grace to confuse you. Verse 8. But even if we or an angel from heaven shall preach a gospel different than the one we preach to you, let them be under God's curse. Let me be clear. Anyone, no matter who they are, that brings you a different gospel than the gospel that you have received, let them be condemned and cursed. I'm obviously not trying to flatter you or water down my message to be popular with men, but my supreme passion is to please God. For if all I attempt to do is please people, I would fail to be a true servant of Christ. So when we're looking at these verses, Paul is making some things Very clear, very direct, very simple. What is the good news about Christ? What is the gospel? The grace of Christ, the gospel of grace. Paul's making it very clear, very simple. What is a distorted gospel? What is a fake gospel? Those that are mixing law and grace. But yet the Apostle Paul takes it another step further and says, I don't care who you are. I don't care who your mom is. I don't care who your dad is. I don't care your bishop, your reverend, your pastor. I don't care who it is. Anybody that is preaching this fake gospel, mixing law and grace, is under a curse. And this is why I started off, this my little monologue in the beginning when we start talking about the harsh sayings of the New Testament. Because I don't know if there's I don't believe there's anything harsher in this New Testament as far as believers goes, because, we got to differentiate that between believers and unbelievers. Because if you're not believer, you got hell's fire waiting for you. Let's just make that simple. I'm not going to be going back and forth with that. But when we start talking about believers and we start talking about what's going on in the church, I don't know if there's anything harsher or stronger than the words that Paul is saying here. He's saying, if you're not preaching what I'm preaching, if you're not preaching the gospel of grace, you are under a curse. And some of you older ones, if you've been sitting in church 20, 30, 40 years, you got to be honest with yourself. Is what you're believing or what you're hearing in church, is it in line with Paul is saying right here? Or are you in the crosshairs of God's curse? This is serious business. This isn't something we can play around with and redefine it, spin it, twist it, and make it fit around our belief system. We got to take the word for what it's saying at face value. I don't want to be going on and on about that. Hopefully I don't come off like I'm beating anybody, but I'm just reading. So don't be mad at me. I'm just reading. But what I want to do is I'm going to take 3 more examples out of the word that are really talking about mixing. But if you don't have this understanding of law and grace, if you don't have an understanding first of what the gospel is, then these things won't make sense to you. So as I unpack these things, and I'm going to give you another thing too. When I first heard someone explain this, and I was on the fence with this law and grace years ago, and I heard somebody explain and started unpacking and unveiling these hidden things in the scriptures, it takes the veil of religion off your eyes. The scales fall off your eyes. So I got 3 things that I want to run by you. On this first one, I always thought was like simple and petty in the scriptures. I always thought, this was just something that was irrelevant, something to just look over. And I think most people do the same thing. And this also exposes people that cherry pick things out of the Old Testament, which is the church is, notoriously guilty of. We take things that we think we can drag over and apply to the New Testament, and things that don't make sense to us, we just dismiss it. But you don't realize that when you do that, you're actually offending God by making it seem like God is, making up stupid rules or making up some, weird requirements that don't make any sense. So we just dismiss that. God don't know what he's talking about right there. That don't mean nothing. That doesn't apply to me. But when you have this understanding of law and grace, these things fall into place and then they make sense. Leviticus 19:19 reads, "Ye shall keep my statutes. Thou shalt not let thy cattle gender with a diverse kind. Thou shalt not sow thy field with mingled seed. Neither shall a garment mingled of linen and woolen come upon thee." So we have to ask ourselves, how can blending wool and linen offend God? Naturally speaking, wearing linen keeps you cool, meaning no sweat, indicating rest. Wearing wool produces sweat, indicating works. Linen is a symbol of righteousness. This is why priests wore garments of linen. Since wool is the opposite, this is a symbol of self-righteousness. Blending linen and wool is a picture of righteousness and self-righteousness mixed together. So mixing linen and wool is a picture of mixing the covenants of law and grace. This is pointing to believers that rely on their works, effort, and strength instead of resting and trusting in the finished works of Jesus Christ. Number 2, lukewarm Christians. Revelation 3:15 through 17 reads, I know thy works, that thou art neither cold nor hot. I would thou wert cold or hot. So then, because thou art lukewarm, and neither cold nor hot, I will spew thee out of my mouth. Because thou sayest, I am rich and increased with goods, and have need of nothing. And knowest not that thou art wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. Being lukewarm has nothing to do with how enthusiastic you are. There is nothing wrong with going to a lot of meetings and services, volunteering for a lot of church activities. But you're deceiving yourself if you think these things impress God. Lukewarm Christianity is a mixture of law and grace, and God says it makes him vomit. When you mix the covenants, you strip the law of its severity and perfection and make faith void in the promises of no effect. We run into a lot of problems measuring lukewarmness in terms of zeal. How do you clearly measure hot, warm, cold Christianity? The honest answer to this is impossible. For example, if Billy Graham is the measuring stick, is the definition for being on fire for God, then we all come up short. We all come up as cold Christians. This zeal for God mentality is actually a mask for self-righteousness. It produces a belief that if I try my best, God will be pleased and God will bless me. The number one cause of lukewarmness is this watered down, cheap interpretation of the law. This cheap law is a delusion that God accepts anything less than perfection. Cheap law in lukewarm Christianity produces fake holiness and self-righteousness. Lukewarm Christians brag about the rules they keep and the works that they do, but the Bible clearly states in Ephesians 2:9, not of works, lest any man should boast. Now, this last part is the main part. I normally don't like talking about or having conversations about revelations and the end times and Antichrist and things like that, eschatology and stuff like that, simply because people get crazy. There's just so many wild interpretations and beliefs about the symbolism, because Revelations is heavy in symbolism. So you got to be careful when you're touching these things. And I'm just under the belief that if you're saved, you don't have to worry about it anyway. You know, you're going to heaven. So that's just my position. But there's something real strong going on here. And I think this falls in line with Paul is talking about in Galatians. I think this falls in line what we just talked about with this lukewarm Christianity, that this is serious stuff when we start talking about mixing these covenants and this mixture gospel, this fake gospel. This is serious stuff. We put so much weight and emphasis on what you can do, what you cannot do. And it's like we got all these like weird sayings about what's false doctrine, what's sound doctrine, and false teachers and things like that. These are things that we need to be clear and absolute on. So most of the church would define Babylon as Sin City or lawlessness or just flat out rebellion against God. But the Hebrew word for Babylon means to confuse by mixing. Do a simple, easy Google search. I don't have to, I'm not reaching for anything. So you just Google Hebrew, Babylon, and mixture and see what happens. But I want to take a look at a couple of these verses in the book of Revelations that talks about the word Babylon, talks about Babylon as a city. Remember, Babylon in Revelations, this stuff is very symbolic and it's saying something. And all I'm doing, I ain't like reaching or doing nothing crazy. I'm just applying this understanding of law and grace and the dangers of mixing law and grace and God and how God feels about it. This is serious stuff. First, chapter 17, when we start talking about Revelations chapter 17, the context is God judging a religious system. This is not about Sin City. This is about a religious system that is dominant, and God's going to judge it. Revelation 17, verse 5. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. In Romans 7, Paul illustrates mixing the covenants as spiritual adultery. So as believers, we are dead to the law and married to Christ. To go back and forth between the covenants is spiritual whoredom in God's eyes. So mixing the covenants of law and grace, right? Righteousness by works, righteousness by faith, this is spiritual adultery. Revelations chapter 18, verse 2. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, has become the habitation of devils, in the hold of every foul spirit, and the cage of every unclean and hateful bird. 1 Timothy 4:1 says, Now the Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. I used to believe that when the Bible's talking about, doctrines of devils and, seducing spirits, deceiving spirits, I always thought this was talking about all the religions outside of Christianity. I don't have to call any names, but I always thought that that's what he was talking about. But even in context, when you look at 1 Timothy chapter 4 and you get down to verse 3, Paul starts talking about, they'll be telling people they can't marry, telling people to abstain from certain foods. He's talking about works. He's talking about in the church. Timothy is written to pastors and leaders. So this is talking about preachers in the church that are taking this new covenant of grace and then they're adding things to it, saying if you want to receive something from God, if you want to stay right with God, you want to keep your salvation, you got to do this, you got to do that. You can't do this, you can't do that. That's the doctrine of devils. That's the mixing of the covenants. And this is something that God takes very, very, very seriously. When we sit here and look at these verses in Revelations, there's Babylon, the harlot, Babylon, the habitation of devils. And then we apply that this is talking about the mixture gospel. I sit down and think, I talk to people, various people, and we sit and talk about how for generations, how many generations, not just people that are alive now, but you can go back hundreds of years, how many people love God and go their whole life without having a strong grasp of the cross and not having a strong grasp of the gospel, don't understand it. And then you can read stuff like this and it's almost like I said something like strange or confusing. It's very bizarre. I totally get it though, because it's just a matter of applying humanism and human logic to the scriptures instead of going just off of what the manual is telling us. And we get off into different kinds of things when we're trying to do it our way and not God's way. That's the only way I can make sense out of it. I think some of this understanding in Revelation speaks for itself. So I'm not even going to keep going into it to try to hammer it home. So if you believe you are right with God because your works or your behavior, if you believe that you can receive from God with your works or your behavior, your faith is in vain. Your faith will be of no effect and it won't work. Not only that, but the Bible is actually calling that kind of believing demonic. Just going to read one more verse and then I'm just going to close with that. Hebrews 4 verse 2 says, For unto us was the gospel preached, as well as unto them. But the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. Zechariah 4:7, grace.